The starship Eternal Horizon drifted through the void of space, its massive hull scarred from decades of interstellar travel. Inside the observation deck, Commander Zix-4 of the Valorian Empire stood watching the blue and green planet spinning slowly beneath them. His crystalline form pulsed with colors of deep concern as he studied the surface scans appearing on the holographic display before him. "The situation is worse than we predicted," said First Science Officer Threll, her tentacles moving across the control panels with practiced speed. "The asteroid impact has created a dust cloud that will block sunlight for at least 3 standard cycles. Surface temperatures are already rising in some regions while others freeze. Weather patterns are becoming chaotic." Zix-4 turned his angular head toward the screen showing the impact zone. The asteroid had struck in the southern hemisphere of the planet, creating a crater nearly 100 kilometers wide. But the worst damage came from what happened after. Massive amounts of dust and debris had been thrown into the atmosphere. Earthquakes shook continents far from the impact site. Tsunamis had wiped coastal regions clean of life. "How many species have we confirmed dead?" Zix-4 asked, though he already feared the answer. 47% of all land species are confirmed extinct. Another 30% are in critical danger. The oceanic life forms have fared slightly better, but many food chains have collapsed. Threll paused, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering data. "We estimate total extinction event within 60 standard rotations of this planet." The Valorian Empire had been observing this world for centuries. It was a primitive planet, home to thousands of species still in early development. The Galactic Preservation Council had designated it as a protected observation zone, meaning no interference was allowed until the native life forms reached a certain level of development. But now, that protective classification seemed meaningless. The random cruelty of space had delivered a death sentence in the form of a rock hurtling through the cosmos. "And what of the bipedal species, the ones we designated as potentially intelligent?" Zix-4 asked. Threll manipulated the display, and images appeared showing creatures that walked on 2 legs. They had forward-facing eyes, manipulating appendages with flexible digits, and brains large enough to suggest the beginning of complex thought. The Valorians had been particularly interested in this species, believing they might one day achieve space travel themselves. "Their numbers have been reduced by approximately 80%, Threll reported. "The survivors are scattered across various regions. Our models predict they will be completely extinct within 20 rotations." Zix-4 felt something like sadness pulse through his crystalline structure. It was always tragic to witness the death of a potentially intelligent species. The universe was vast and lonely, and every thinking creature that might one day look up at the stars and wonder was precious. "Maintain observation protocols," Zix-4 ordered. "Document everything. The Council will want a complete record for the archives of lost species." But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen on the dying world below. The bipedal creatures, which the Valorians had named Specimen 7829H in their scientific catalogs, were not dying according to schedule. The observation drones scattered across the planet's surface began sending back confusing data. Instead of scattering and perishing individually, the creatures were gathering together in large groups. They were moving towards certain geographic locations with what appeared to be purpose and coordination. "I do not understand these readings," Threll said during a routine briefing on the 5th day after the impact. "The specimens are displaying organized behavior. They appear to be communicating across vast distances using primitive sound-based language." Zix-4 examined the data with growing interest. "Show me the largest gathering." The display shifted to show a region in the northeastern part of the primary landmass. Temperatures there had dropped significantly as the dust cloud thickened. Food sources were becoming scarce. By all logical calculations, this should have been a death zone. Yet thousands of Specimen 7829H had gathered there, and they were not simply waiting to die. "They are building structures," Threll said, her voice carrying a note of surprise that was rare for her species. Primitive shelters using available materials, stone, wood, animal skins. And they are. She paused, rechecking her readings. Commander, they appear to be sharing food resources. Sharing, explain. The strongest and healthiest specimens are giving portions of their own food to the weakest. This is highly inefficient behavior. From a survival standpoint, the logical approach would be for the strongest to conserve resources for themselves. This sharing behavior accelerates the death rate of the healthy while only marginally extending the survival of the weak. Zix-4 moved closer to the display, his crystalline form flickering with intense interest. Yet they continue to do it. Yes, across all observed gatherings, it appears to be a universal behavior among surviving specimens. On the surface of the wounded planet, a female of the species held a small child against her body for warmth. The child was not her own offspring. Its parents had been killed in the first wave of destruction. The female had found it crying beside the bodies of its family and had simply picked it up and carried it along as she fled toward higher ground. Now they huddled together in a cave with 40 others. Outside, the sky was dark even during what should have been daytime. Ash fell like gray snow, covering everything. The temperature dropped steadily. Food was whatever could be scavenged from the dying forest around them. An old male approached the female and the child. His body was thin and weak. He had been a leader of sorts in the time before the sky fell, respected for his wisdom and knowledge of the land. Now he carried a small piece of dried meat in his gnarled hands. He held it out to the female. She shook her head, gesturing toward his thin frame. He needed the food more than they did. He was already close to death. The old male simply placed the meat beside her and returned to his spot near the cave entrance. He sat down facing outward, watching the ash fall, acting as a lookout for dangers that might approach. He would rather die protecting others than eat while they starved. This scene repeated itself countless times across the dying world. The Valorians watched and recorded it all, their confusion growing with each passing day. Their death rate is not accelerating as predicted, Threll reported on the 10th day. In fact, it appears to be slowing. The sharing behavior is somehow increasing survival rates across the group structures. How is that possible? Zix-4 asked. Mathematically, that should not work. I cannot explain it. The mathematics clearly show that individual hoarding of resources is the optimal survival strategy. Yet these creatures are doing the opposite, and they are surviving longer than our models predicted. But there was more happening than simple resource sharing. The Valorians observed the specimens working together to build larger and more complex shelters. They watched as hunting parties organized themselves, with stronger members protecting weaker ones. They saw the creation of primitive tools designed specifically to help the injured and elderly move and function. Most puzzling of all, they observed the specimens making sounds together in rhythmic patterns. The sounds served no obvious survival purpose. They did not convey practical information about food or danger. Yet the specimens who participated in this behavior appeared to have higher survival rates than those who did not. Are they singing? Threll asked, uncertain of the word even as she used it. I believe so, Zix-4 replied. I have read about this behavior in the archives of other species. It is said to have psychological benefits. It creates bonds between individuals. It maintains what some species call hope. Hope is not a scientific concept, Threll said. No, but perhaps it is a survival concept. On day 15, the Valorians received a transmission from the Galactic Preservation Council. The message was brief and formal. Planet designation 7829 was being officially classified as a total extinction event. All observation resources were to be redirected to other systems where life still had a chance. The Eternal Horizon was ordered to withdraw and file its final reports. Zix-4 read the order twice before responding. "Acknowledged," he transmitted back. "However, I am requesting an extension of observation protocols. There are anomalies in the extinction pattern that require further study." The Council's response came quickly. "What anomalies?" Zix-4 looked at the latest survival figures for specimen 7829H against all predictions, against all mathematical models, against the very laws of nature that should have governed their fate. The creatures were still alive. Their numbers had stabilized. Small groups were actually growing as scattered survivors found their way to established camps. "The primary intelligent species is displaying unprecedented resilience," Zix-4 reported. "Death rate projections are no longer accurate. I believe continued observation may yield valuable scientific data about extinction resistance." There was a long pause before the Council responded. "Extension granted. Continue observation. Report findings immediately." Zix-4 turned back to the viewing screen, watching the creatures below as they huddled together against the cold, shared their meager food, sang their strange songs, and refused to die according to schedule. "What are you?" he whispered to himself, though he knew the creatures could not hear him. "What makes you different?" He would spend the next many months searching for that answer. The winter that followed the impact was the worst the planet had ever experienced. The dust cloud blocked so much sunlight that temperatures dropped to levels never before recorded. Ice spread from the poles toward the equator. Rivers froze solid. Forests died standing, their bare branches reaching toward a sun they could no longer see. The Valorians documented it all, expecting each day to record the final death of specimen 7829H each day. They were disappointed. In the caves and primitive shelters scattered across the frozen landscape, the creatures huddled together and survived. They burned whatever would burn for warmth. They ate whatever could be eaten, including things they would never have considered food in better times. They wrapped themselves in animal skins and held each other through the endless nights. And they kept singing. The death toll was horrific. Thousands perished from cold, starvation, and disease, but thousands more lived. They lived because they refused to give up. They lived because they helped each other. They lived because somewhere deep in their primitive minds, there burned a fire that no cosmic disaster could extinguish. The Valorians had a word for this fire, though they rarely used it because they rarely encountered it. The word was persistence. But watching specimen 7829H, Zix-4 began to think that word was not strong enough. These creatures had something beyond persistence. They had defiance. They had will. They had what would one day be called humanity. Months passed in darkness and cold. The survivors on the wounded planet learned to measure time not by the position of a sun they could rarely see, but by the cycles of their own bodies and the gradual thinning of the ash that fell from the sky. The largest survivor camp had grown to nearly 300 individuals. They occupied a system of caves carved into a mountainside, protected from the worst of the weather by the stone itself. Water came from melting snow. Food came from hunting parties that ventured out into the frozen wasteland and returned with whatever small creatures they could find still living. A young male named Tark had become one of the leaders of this camp, not because he was the oldest or the strongest, but because he was the one who always returned from hunting. Other hunters died in the cold or were killed by the desperate predators that still roamed the dead forests. Tark came back. He always came back, usually carrying meat for the camp, and sometimes dragging another survivor he had found wandering alone. The old ones told stories about the time before the sky fell. They spoke of warm summers and green forests and rivers full of fish. The young ones listened but did not really believe. They had been born into the dying world and knew nothing else. For them, cold and hunger and darkness were simply the nature of existence. But Tark remembered. He had been old enough when the disaster struck to remember running through tall grass, chasing birds that flew into a blue sky. He remembered the warmth of sunlight on his skin, and at night, when the others slept, he would climb to the highest point of the cave system and look up at the perpetually gray sky, searching for any sign that the darkness might someday end. High above, invisible to those below, the Valorian observation drones watched and recorded. Specimen activity patterns are changing, First Science Officer Threll reported to Commander Zix-4. Social structures are becoming more complex. We are observing the emergence of specialized roles within the group units. She displayed the data on the holographic screen. This specimen appears to have taken on a leadership function. This one is primarily responsible for food acquisition. These specimens focus on maintaining fire sources. This group has specialized in creating tools and shelters. Division of labor, Zix-4 noted, a sign of advancing social development. Yes, but Commander, they should not be developing at all. They should be dead. Instead, they are organizing themselves with increasing efficiency. Threll's tentacles moved in patterns that indicated confusion. Our extinction models were not simply inaccurate, they were completely wrong. Zix-4 studied the images of the creatures below. Update your models with the new data. What is the revised survival projection? Threll worked at her console for several moments. When she turned back to face the commander, her dark eyes were wide with an emotion he had rarely seen in her logical species. Commander, if current trends continue, Specimen 7829H will not go extinct. The population will stabilize and eventually begin to grow again. They are going to survive. The words hung in the air of the observation deck. In the long history of the Galactic Preservation Council, thousands of species had been documented going extinct after cataclysmic events. Not one had ever come back from conditions as severe as those on planet 7829. Continue observation, Zix-4 ordered, and begin compiling a comprehensive report for the Council. They will want to understand how this is possible. But even as he gave the order, Zix-4 suspected that understanding might not come easily. The survival of Specimen 7829H defied logic. It defied mathematics. It defied everything the Valorians believed they knew about the nature of life and death. Below, on the frozen surface, the creatures continued their impossible fight for survival. Tark led his hunting party through the dead forest, following tracks in the ash-covered snow. The tracks belonged to something large, larger than the small rodents and birds they usually found. Larger meant more food. More food meant more people in the camp would survive another few days. There were 5 in the hunting party. Tark carried a spear with a sharpened stone tip. The others carried similar weapons, though none were as skilled with them as Tark. They moved in silence, communicating through gestures they had developed over months of hunting together. The tracks led them deeper into the forest, past frozen trees that cracked and groaned in the bitter wind. The light was gray and flat, as it always was now. There were no shadows because there was no sun to cast them, just the eternal twilight of a world covered in ash. They found their prey in a small clearing. It was a creature they had no name for, something that had once lived in the mountains but had been driven down by the cold and hunger to forage in the lowlands. It was as tall as Tark at the shoulder, covered in thick white fur, with curved horns and desperate eyes. The creature saw them and froze. For a moment, hunter and hunted simply looked at each other. Both were starving. Both were fighting to survive. In another time, in another world, they might never have met. But the disaster had thrown all the old rules away. Tark raised his spear and charged. The creature ran, but it was weak from hunger and cold. Tark and his hunters were weak too, but they were fueled by something the creature lacked. They had people waiting for them back at the camp. They had hungry children and sick elders depending on them. They had a responsibility that burned in their chests and pushed them forward when their bodies wanted to collapse. The hunt lasted for what felt like hours. The creature was strong despite its hunger, and it fought viciously when cornered. One of Tark's hunters went down with a deep gash from those curved horns, but the others pressed the attack, stabbing with their spears, dodging the creature's desperate charges, wearing it down until finally it stumbled and fell. Tark delivered the killing blow. There was no joy in it, only relief, food for the camp, survival for another few days. They carried the creature back in pieces, stopping frequently to rest. The wounded hunter was supported between two others, his bloody side wrapped in strips of animal hide. He would probably survive. Probably. In the world after the sky fell, nothing was certain. When they reached the camp, they were greeted with cries of relief and celebration. The meat was divided according to need. The weakest and youngest ate first. The hunters ate last, despite having worked the hardest to obtain the food. This was simply how things were done. No one questioned it. No one hoarded. No one fought for more than their share. Watching from above, Threll noted this behavior in her records. The resource distribution patterns continue to prioritize vulnerable individuals over productive ones, she reported. This is inefficient from a survival optimization standpoint, yet the overall population survival rate continues to improve. Perhaps, Zix4 suggested, efficiency is not the only factor in survival. Threll considered this. Then what is? Zix4 watched as the creatures below gathered around their fires, sharing their meal, making their rhythmic sounds together. I believe they would call it something like bond, or perhaps connection. They survive not as individuals but as a collective unit. The strength of one becomes the strength of all. We have observed similar behavior in certain insect species, Threll noted. Hive structures with collective survival mechanisms. Yes, but those species have no individual consciousness. Each member is simply a component of the larger organism. These creatures are different. Each one has its own mind, its own desires, its own sense of self. They choose to work together. They choose to sacrifice for each other. That choice is what makes them remarkable. The months continued to pass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sky began to lighten. The ash cloud that had shrouded the planet was finally beginning to thin. Sunlight, weak and pale but unmistakably real, began to filter through to the surface. The first time Tark saw the sun, he wept. He stood at the cave entrance, staring at the small patch of blue that had appeared in the perpetually gray sky, and tears ran down his weathered face. Around him, others emerged from the caves, looking up at the miracle above them. Some of the youngest ones had never seen the sun before. They squinted at the light, confused and frightened. But the old ones remembered. They raised their arms toward the warmth, their faces transforming with an emotion that had been rare in the long months of darkness. Hope, real hope, not just the stubborn refusal to die, but actual belief that things might get better. The Valorians recorded this moment from orbit. Their instruments measured the exact amount of solar radiation reaching the surface, the rate at which the ash cloud was dispersing, the projected timeline for atmospheric stabilization. All the data confirmed what the creatures below already knew in their hearts. The worst was over, spring was coming. But survival was still not guaranteed. The ecosystem of the planet had been devastated. Most plant species were extinct or dormant. Animal populations had crashed. The food chains that had sustained life for millions of years were broken. Rebuilding them would take time that many survivors did not have. We are entering a critical phase, Threll reported. The immediate crisis of the impact winter is ending, but the survivors face new challenges. Food scarcity will remain severe until plant life recovers. Disease is spreading in several population centers due to weakened immune systems, and there are indications of conflict between different survivor groups competing for limited resources. This last observation troubled Zix4 the most. He had watched other species tear themselves apart in the aftermath of disasters. Competition for scarce resources often led to violence, which led to more deaths, which led to extinction. It was a tragically common pattern. "Show me these conflicts," he ordered. The display shifted to show an encounter between two survivor groups. One was larger, well-organized, occupying a territory with a small stream of unfrozen water. The other was smaller, desperate, clearly on the verge of collapse. They had approached the larger group's territory seeking access to the water. Zix-4 expected to see violence. He expected the larger group to drive off the smaller, protecting their resources with force. This was the logical, efficient behavior that his models predicted. Instead, he watched as the leader of the larger group approached the smaller group with empty hands raised. He watched as the two leaders communicated, gesturing and making sounds. He watched as the larger group divided their water supply and gave a portion to the smaller group. Then he watched as both groups returned to their respective territories, without a single violent act. "I do not understand," Threll said. "They are giving away resources they need for their own survival. This is the same behavior we observed during the impact winter. It should be decreasing now that conditions are improving and individual survival is more achievable." But Zix-4 was beginning to understand. It is not decreasing because it was never about individual survival. These creatures do not think in those terms. They think in terms of collective survival. Everyone survives or no one does. That is their fundamental belief. "But that is not how life works," Threll protested. "Evolution favors those who compete successfully for resources. Cooperation is only advantageous when it benefits the individual. What we are observing is pure altruism, which should be evolutionarily impossible." "And yet," Zix-4 said softly, "they are the ones surviving. Perhaps we need to reconsider what we believe about how life works." Spring arrived slowly, painfully, but it arrived. The ash cloud continued to thin. Temperatures rose. Snow began to melt. And in places where life had seemed impossible, green shoots began to push through the gray ash covering the ground. The survivors watched these signs of renewal with something like wonder. Many had believed they would never see growing things again. Many had accepted that they would die in the frozen darkness, but life was returning, and they were still there to witness it. Tark stood at the edge of what had once been a meadow. The ground was covered in ash, but here and there, small plants were emerging. He knelt down and touched one gently, feeling the soft green leaves between his fingers. Behind him, other members of the camp gathered to see this miracle. A child pushed forward through the crowd. She was one of the youngest survivors, born just before the sky fell, too young to remember the world that had been. She looked at the small plant with wide eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Tark searched his memory for the word. It had been so long since he had needed it. "It is called grass," he said finally. "Before it covered everything. As far as you could see, grass everywhere." The child tried to imagine this and failed. But she reached out and touched the plant anyway, feeling its aliveness, its promise of a future she could not yet comprehend. Above, in the orbiting starship, the Valorians documented this moment as well. They had witnessed the impact, the winter, the deaths of thousands. Now they were witnessing something far rarer in their experience. They were witnessing recovery. "Population counts are stabilizing across all observed survivor groups," Threll reported. "Birth rates are beginning to rise. Mortality rates are declining. Commander, I believe we are witnessing the beginning of a genuine recovery." Zix-4 said nothing. He simply watched the creatures below as they discovered the returning spring, as they touched the growing plants, as they looked up at a sky that was slowly turning blue again. He thought about all the extinction events he had witnessed in his long career. Hundreds of species, wiped out by disasters natural and artificial. None of them had done what specimen 7829H had done. None of them had refused to die. None of them had held on to hope through the impossible darkness. "What will you become?" he asked the creatures silently. "What will you do with this gift you have given yourselves?" He suspected the answer would be beyond anything he could imagine. The first full summer after the cataclysm arrived with warmth that many survivors had forgotten was possible. The ash cloud had dispersed enough that sunlight reached the surface for most of the day. Rivers flowed freely. Plants spread across the recovering landscape in waves of green. The Valorian observation drones captured images of the creatures emerging from their caves and shelters, standing in the sunlight, raising their faces toward the sky. After so long in darkness and cold, the warmth felt like a blessing beyond measure. Commander Zix-4 watched these images with an emotion he could not quite name. His crystalline form pulsed with colors of deep contemplation as he observed the survivors beginning to build new lives in the recovering world. The population has grown by 12% in the past 3 rotations, First Science Officer Threll reported. Infant survival rates are improving significantly. Food sources are becoming more stable as plant life recovers and animal populations begin to rebuild. And the social structures, Zix-4 asked. Evolving rapidly. The isolated survivor groups are beginning to make contact with each other. Trade networks are forming. Information is being shared about successful survival techniques. Threll paused, her tentacles moving in patterns of something like admiration. Commander, they are not just surviving anymore. They are rebuilding. The largest survivor camp had grown to over 500 individuals. They had outgrown their original cave system and had begun constructing permanent structures in the valley below. The buildings were simple, made of stone and wood and animal skins, but they represented something profound. They represented a belief in the future. Tark oversaw much of this construction, though he would not have used that word. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. When others needed guidance, they came to him. When disputes arose, he helped resolve them. When the young ones asked questions about the world that had been, he answered as best he could. He was older now than he had ever expected to be. During the worst of the impact winter, he had assumed he would die. Everyone had assumed they would die. But they had not died, and now here they were, building houses and planting seeds and raising children in a world that was slowly healing around them. One evening, as the sun set in colors of orange and pink that still seemed miraculous after the gray months, an old woman approached Tark. She was one of the eldest survivors, nearly blind now and so frail that walking was difficult. But her mind was still sharp, and she carried with her memories that no one else possessed. "You must remember what happened," she said to him. "You must tell the young ones. They need to know how we survived." Tark looked out at the settlement below them, at the children playing between the new buildings, at the adults going about the daily work of living. What should I tell them? Tell them that we faced death and did not surrender. Tell them that we held on to each other when holding on was all we had. Tell them that we are stronger together than any one of us could ever be alone. The old woman reached out and gripped his arm with surprising strength. Tell them that this is who we are. This is what we do. When the darkness comes, we make our own light. Tark considered her words. They were simple words, but they captured something essential about what had happened, about how they had done the impossible and lived when everything said they should have died. "I will tell them," he promised. In the orbiting starship, the Valorians received a new message from the Galactic Preservation Council. The tone of the communication had shifted dramatically since the first extinction declaration months ago. The Council requests a full analysis of Specimen 7829H survival mechanisms, the message read. This event represents the first confirmed recovery from a Category 5 extinction-level disaster. Understanding how this species achieved survival could have implications for preservation efforts across the galaxy. Zix-4 and Threll worked together on the report, compiling months of observation data into a comprehensive document. But as they worked, they both realized that the data alone could not explain what they had witnessed. "The mathematics still do not work," Threll admitted. "Based on resource availability, population distribution, and environmental conditions, specimen 7829H should have gone extinct. The individual survival optimizations were not present. The behaviors we observed were consistently suboptimal from a pure efficiency standpoint. Then we must look beyond efficiency, HFY said. What factors are we not accounting for? They reviewed the data again, focusing on the behaviors that had puzzled them most. The sharing of food with the weak and sick, the adoption of orphaned offspring, the protection of elderly individuals who could no longer contribute to survival, the singing and storytelling that served no apparent practical purpose. And then there was something else, something harder to measure but impossible to ignore. During the worst of the crisis, when death seemed inevitable and giving up would have been the logical choice, these creatures had simply refused to accept their fate. They had continued fighting when fighting made no mathematical sense. They had hoped when hope was irrational. I believe, HFY said slowly, that we are observing a form of survival mechanism that our models do not account for. These creatures possess something that enhances their collective survival beyond what individual optimization would achieve. What would you call this mechanism? Threll asked. HFY considered the question for a long moment. In their primitive language, I believe they have many words for it: courage, determination, will. But perhaps the most accurate term would be something like spirit. They have a collective spirit that refuses to be extinguished. Spirit is not a scientific concept, Threll said, echoing her earlier objection about hope. No, HFY agreed, but perhaps science does not capture everything that is real. Below, the survivors continued their work of rebuilding. Gardens were planted as memories of agriculture returned. Hunting techniques were shared between groups. Children were taught the skills they would need to thrive in the healing world. And at night, around fires that now burned for warmth and community rather than desperate survival, the stories were told. Stories of the time before the sky fell. Stories of the terrible winter that followed. Stories of those who had died and those who had lived. Stories of courage and sacrifice and love. Tark became one of the primary storytellers. He had a gift for it, a way of making the past come alive in words. When he spoke of the darkest days, the listeners felt the cold and hunger and fear. When he spoke of the moments of hope, they felt that too. And when he spoke of those who had given everything so that others might live, tears flowed freely. We are here because of them, Tark would say at the end of each telling. Every one of us who died during the dark time gave something to those who survived. We carry them with us. We honor them by living. We honor them by never forgetting. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the stories into their young hearts. They had been born into a world of recovery, but now they understood the price that had been paid for their existence. They understood that survival was not just an accident of fortune, but an achievement of collective will. 1 year after the impact, a ceremony was held at the largest survivor settlement. Representatives from 12 different survivor groups had gathered to mark the anniversary. It was the largest gathering of the species since the disaster, nearly 2,000 individuals coming together to remember and to celebrate. The Valorians watched from orbit, their observation drones capturing every moment of the ceremony. This is unprecedented behavior, Threll noted. They are commemorating the disaster itself. Most species that survive catastrophic events attempt to forget the trauma. These specimens are deliberately remembering it. Perhaps they understand something we do not, HFY replied. Perhaps remembering is essential to ensuring it never happens again, or perhaps the act of remembering together strengthens the bonds that saved them. On the surface, the ceremony reached its climax. A massive fire had been built in the center of the gathering area, and as the sun set, all 2,000 survivors began to sing together. The sound rose up into the evening air, a wave of voices united in a single melody. It was not a song of mourning, though it acknowledged loss. It was not a song of triumph, though it celebrated survival. It was something beyond both, a declaration of existence, a statement of identity. We are here, we survived, we will continue. The Valorians had no way to translate the words of the song. Their linguistic databases were not sophisticated enough to decode the primitive language, but they did not need to understand the words to feel the power of what they were witnessing. "Commander," Threll said quietly, "I believe I understand now why they survived." "Tell me." "They survived because they would not accept any other outcome. Extinction was not a possibility they allowed themselves to believe in, and because they refused to believe in it, they refused to let it happen." Threll paused, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering light of the ceremony fire visible on the display. "It is not logical, it is not efficient, but it is real." Zix-4 nodded slowly. "Include that in the report to the Council. Let them try to understand it. Perhaps they will succeed where we have failed." "Do you believe they will?" "No," Zix-4 admitted. "I believe that what we have witnessed here is something that cannot be fully understood from the outside. It can only be experienced, and perhaps that is the most important lesson of all." The days continued to pass. Seasons changed. The planet healed, and the creatures that had refused to die continued to grow and multiply and spread across their recovering world. The Valorians maintained their observation for another full year before finally receiving orders to move on to other systems. By then, the population of specimen 7829H had recovered to approximately 30% of its pre-impact levels and was growing steadily. New settlements had been established across multiple continents. Trade and communication networks connected distant communities. Culture and language were evolving rapidly as the species adapted to its transformed world. On the final day of observation, Zix-4 stood at the viewing window and looked down at the blue and green planet one last time. The scars of the impact were still visible from orbit, a massive crater and the dead zones around it. But life was returning even to those wounded places. Green was spreading. Water was flowing. The planet was alive, and so were its dominant inhabitants. "Zix-4, Threll said, interrupting his contemplation. "The final report has been transmitted to the Council. We are cleared to depart." "Thank you, Threll. Set course for the next system. I will join you on the bridge shortly." When he was alone, Zix-4 allowed himself a moment of something that might have been emotion. He had witnessed many things in his long career, but nothing quite like this. He had watched a species face extinction and simply refused to accept it. He had watched them hold onto each other through the darkness and emerge into the light together. The Galactic Preservation Council would study the data for decades, trying to understand the mechanisms behind what the survivors had achieved. Scientists across the galaxy would develop theories and models and explanations, but Zix-4 suspected that none of them would capture the full truth. The truth was simple and complicated at the same time. These creatures had survived because they loved each other. They had survived because they believed in each other. They had survived because giving up was simply not something they were capable of doing. They were remarkable. They were terrifying in a way. And they were going to change the galaxy someday. Zix-4 was certain of it. A species that could survive what they had survived, that could turn certain death into legendary triumph, was a species that would not be content to remain on a single planet forever. One day they would look up at the stars and wonder what was out there. One day they would build ships and set sail across the void. One day they would meet the Valorians and the Threll and the countless other species that inhabited the galaxy. And when that day came, the galaxy had better be ready. Zix-4 turned away from the window and headed for the bridge. The Eternal Horizon's engines hummed to life, and the starship began to pull away from the planet that had taught him so much about the nature of life and death and everything in between. Behind him, on the surface of their healing world, the creatures that would one day call themselves human continued their work of rebuilding. They planted crops and raised children, and told stories around fires that burned for joy rather than desperate survival. And in their hearts, they carried the memory of the darkness they had endured and the light they had found within themselves. It was a memory that would shape everything they became. It was a memory that would drive them to the stars. But that was still far in the future. For now, it was enough to be alive. It was enough to watch the sun rise and know that tomorrow would come. It was enough to hold each other and remember those who had been lost and celebrate those who remained. A young child ran through one of the new settlements, laughing as she chased a butterfly that had emerged from the recovering meadows. Her parents watched her with smiles on their faces, their hearts full of a love that had carried their species through impossible darkness. "This is who we are," Tark thought as he watched the child play. "This is what we do. When death comes for us, we look it in the eye and we refuse to surrender. We hold on to each other. We make our own light. And we survive." The last Valorian observation drone deactivated as the Eternal Horizon broke orbit. The final image it captured was of that child, that laughing child running through the meadow, reaching for a butterfly that danced just beyond her grasp. It was, the Valorians later decided, the perfect image to end their report. A child reaching for something beautiful, a species reaching for a future that had seemed impossible. A triumph that had turned death into legend.